Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the biggest chapter in someone else's life. Rain had been falling over Boston since early afternoon, turning sidewalks into mirrors that reflected the endless glow of traffic lights and storefront windows. By the time I finished my shift at the neighborhood bakery, my feet hurt, my apron smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread, and my shoulders felt heavier than the clouds hanging above the city. My name is Grace Sullivan. I was 31 years old, and life had taught me to count every dollar before I spent it. Every paycheck disappeared into rent, groceries, medications for my father, and bills that always seemed to arrive faster than I could earn enough to pay them. Even so, my father often reminded me that being tired and being bitter were never the same thing. I carried those words with me every day. The bakery owner smiled as I waved goodbye, locking the front door behind me while the rain came down even harder. I opened my old blue umbrella, the one with a slightly bent handle that had survived more winters than I could remember, and started the 15-minute walk toward the bus stop. The evening commuters hurried past without looking at one another, everyone focused on staying dry and getting home. I understood them. On nights like this, warmth felt like a luxury. As I reached the corner where the city bus usually stopped, something caught my attention. A little girl stood alone beneath the shelter, wearing a light sweater completely unsuitable for the cold rain. Her blonde hair clung to her cheeks, tiny drops of water sliding from the ends as she hugged a small backpack tightly against her chest. She looked no older than 8. There was no umbrella, no parent, no familiar face waiting nearby. People walked past without stopping, assuming someone else would help. For a brief moment, I almost did the same. Then the little girl looked up, and our eyes met. She smiled, not because she was happy, but because children sometimes smile when they are trying to be brave. I walked over and lowered my umbrella so it covered both of us. "Hi there," I said gently. "Are you waiting for someone?" She nodded. "My daddy said he would be right back." I glanced around the busy intersection. Cars crawled through the rain while headlights reflected across the wet pavement. "How long ago?" She shrugged with the innocent uncertainty only children possess. "A while." I knelt slightly, so we were eye level. "Do you know his phone number?" She shook her head. "He always remembers mine." I smiled softly. "That sounds like something dads do." She giggled, and somehow the sound made the rain feel a little less cold. Minutes passed. One bus arrived, then another, but neither brought the person she was waiting for. The wind picked up, blowing rain beneath the shelter until even standing underneath it no longer kept us dry. I looked down at my umbrella. It was old, patched near one corner with clear tape, and probably worth replacing months ago. It was also the only umbrella I owned. Without thinking much longer, I gently placed the handle into her tiny hands. "Here," I said. "You should keep this." Her eyes widened. "What about you?" I looked toward the gray sky and laughed quietly. "I have survived rain before." She hesitated. "Daddy says people should not give away things they need." I smiled. "Maybe sometimes helping someone else becomes exactly what we need." She held the umbrella tightly, as though it were something precious. "Thank you." We stood together for several more minutes until I finally noticed a line of black vehicles turning slowly onto the street. They moved carefully through traffic without sirens or flashing lights, but something about them drew quiet attention from everyone nearby. I had no idea who they belonged to, and honestly, it was none of my business. Relief washed over me anyway. Whoever was coming looked like they were searching for someone. I gently squeezed the little girl's shoulder. "I think your ride is here." She looked up at me with bright blue eyes filled with gratitude. "Will I see you again?" I smiled as the rain soaked through my sweater the moment I stepped away from the umbrella. "Maybe someday." Before the first vehicle reached the curb, I turned and disappeared into the crowd of umbrellas moving along the sidewalk, never once looking back. I did not see the tall man stepping from the lead SUV with intricate tattoos climbing above the collar of his dark coat and disappearing beneath his sleeves as he rushed toward his daughter. I did not hear the little girl telling him about the kind woman who stood in the rain so she would not have to. I only knew that I arrived home completely soaked, carrying nothing except a tired smile, while somewhere behind me, destiny had quietly begun remembering my name. I never imagined that an old blue umbrella could become the most important object in someone else's memory. By the time I reached my apartment, my sweater clung to my skin, my shoes squished with every step across the hallway, and rainwater dripped from my hair onto the worn wooden floor. My father looked up from his favorite chair with a concerned smile. You forgot your umbrella? He asked. I hung my damp sweater near the heater and laughed softly. Not exactly. As I made him a cup of hot tea, I told him about the little girl waiting alone in the rain. I told him how frightened she tried not to look, how brave her smile had been, and how she had promised her father would return. My father listened without interrupting, his weathered hands wrapped around the warm mug. When I finished, he simply nodded. Then the umbrella found the person who needed it most. I smiled because somehow he always knew the right thing to say. Across the city, inside one of the largest private homes overlooking Boston Harbor, 8-year-old Sophie Moretti sat comfortably beneath a blanket with my old umbrella carefully folded beside her. Adrian Moretti remained kneeling in front of her, even though she was already safe. His tattooed hands, covered in intricate black ink stretching from his fingers beneath his sleeves and continuing above the collar around his neck, gently brushed damp strands of hair away from her face. Were you scared? He asked quietly. Sophie shook her head. A little. Then her face brightened. But a nice lady stayed with me. Adrian glanced toward the faded umbrella resting beside her. It was patched with clear tape and showed years of careful use. She gave you this? Sophie nodded proudly. She said she had. Survived rain before. Adrian fell silent. His security team had spent nearly 30 minutes searching nearby streets after Sophie wandered away while chasing a colorful balloon during the sudden storm. Those 30 minutes had felt endless. The thought that a stranger had chosen to stay with his daughter instead of walking away settled deeply inside him. One of his closest assistants stepped forward. Sir, we have checked the immediate area, but the woman has already left. Adrian never looked away from the umbrella. Did anyone speak with her? No, sir. Sophie gently interrupted. Daddy. He smiled immediately. Yes. Can we tell her thank you? Adrian looked into his daughter's hopeful eyes. I intend to. The next morning his search quietly began. There were no public announcements and no rewards offered. Adrian understood something about people that years of success had taught him well. Anyone who gave away the only umbrella she owned to comfort a child during a cold storm was probably not motivated by money. Instead, he reviewed security footage from nearby businesses with calm patience. Camera after camera showed the same smiling woman walking through heavy rain, carrying no umbrella at all. One recording finally revealed her stepping out of a neighborhood bakery, wearing an apron with the shop's logo. Adrian paused the image. Grace Sullivan. The embroidered name stitched neatly above the apron pocket became the first real clue. Meanwhile, my morning started like every other. I unlocked the bakery before sunrise, arranged fresh loaves behind the display case, and filled the room with the comforting smell of cinnamon rolls and warm sourdough bread. Customers arrived one after another, most too busy thinking about work to notice anything except their coffee orders. Around 10 o'clock, an elderly woman reached the register and realized she had left her wallet at home. Before she could apologize, I quietly placed a small paper bag containing her bread into her hands. You can pay next time, I said. Tears filled her eyes. Are you sure? I smiled. Bread tastes better when nobody worries. She thanked me several times before leaving. Unseen from across the street, Adrian watched through the bakery window from the back seat of a black sedan. He had expected to find someone generous because of one unusual evening. Instead, he discovered kindness woven into ordinary moments. Grace did not behave differently because anyone was watching. She simply lived that way. His assistant looked toward him. Should we introduce ourselves? Adrian slowly shook his head. Not yet. Why? Adrian watched me help another customer carry a heavy box to her car before returning inside with the same quiet smile. Because gratitude should never interrupt someone's peace. He looked once more at the old umbrella resting beside him on the leather seat, carefully dried overnight and ready to be returned. When we meet, he said softly, it will be to thank her, not to change who she is. For the next several days, I believe the little girl had become nothing more than a warm memory carried home inside the sound of falling rain. Life returned to its familiar rhythm before sunrise. Every morning, I unlocked the bakery while the streets were still quiet, switched on the ovens, and watched the first trays of fresh bread slowly fill the room with the comforting scent of butter, cinnamon, and warm dough. Customers often told me our bakery smelled like home. I always smiled because home, at least for me, had never been a place. It had always been a person. My father sat by the kitchen window every morning waiting for me to leave, reminding me to eat breakfast before work and to wear a sweater even when I insisted I was not cold. His health had become more fragile over the past year, but somehow his optimism remained stronger than either of us. After my bakery shift ended, I walked 3 blocks to a neighborhood food pantry where I volunteered every Wednesday afternoon. It was never anything extraordinary. I stocked shelves, carried boxes, and handed fresh bread to families who needed it more than I did. Some people thanked me with words. Others simply smiled with tired eyes. Both meant the same thing. That afternoon, a little boy accidentally dropped an entire bag of apples onto the sidewalk outside the pantry. The fruit rolled in every direction, across the pavement. Before his mother could apologize, I laughed, knelt beside him, and helped gather every apple one by one. He looked embarrassed until I handed him the last one with an exaggerated bow that made him burst into laughter. His mother quietly thanked me before they walked away. Moments like that always stayed with me longer than difficult ones. Across the street, behind lightly tinted windows, Adrian Moretti watched in silence. His tattooed hands rested calmly against the steering wheel while the old blue umbrella remained folded on the passenger seat beside him. He had now observed Grace Sullivan for almost a week without ever interrupting her life. Every place she visited told the same story. The bakery, the food pantry, the pharmacy where she patiently waited while older customers found the correct prescriptions, the small neighborhood grocery store where she carried reusable bags instead of buying new ones. She moved through the city without expecting anyone to notice her, yet somehow everyone seemed to remember her kindness. Adrian had built his success by studying people carefully before making decisions. Usually the closer he looked, the more hidden motives appeared. With Grace, the opposite happened. The more he observed, the simpler she became. There was no performance, no attempt to impress anyone. She behaved exactly the same whether she was alone or surrounded by strangers. One of his trusted associates quietly entered the parked sedan. "Sir, we completed the background review." Adrian accepted the folder but did not open it immediately. "Tell me." Grace Sullivan, 31 years old, lives with her father, works full-time at the bakery, volunteers every Wednesday. No financial problems beyond ordinary household expenses. No legal issues. No unusual connections. Adrian remained thoughtful. "Anything else?" The associate hesitated before smiling slightly. Several people described her with the same word. Adrian looked up. "Which word?" "Reliable." Adrian leaned back in his seat, repeating the word silently. Reliable. In his world, loyalty was negotiated, purchased, or earned over years. Reliability without expectation felt almost unfamiliar. Meanwhile, I finished organizing the pantry shelves and stepped outside into bright afternoon sunshine that finally replaced the week of endless rain. The air smelled fresh, carrying the first hints of spring despite the lingering chill. As I walked home, I noticed a small flower stand preparing to close for the day. A bucket near the entrance held several bouquets marked with a discount sign because they would not last another morning. I spent the last $12 in my wallet on a bundle of yellow daisies. They had always been my father's favorite. When I walked through our apartment door and placed the flowers into an old glass jar, his tired face brightened immediately. "Those are beautiful," he whispered. I laughed. They were almost free. He looked at the flowers for a long moment before looking back at me. "Grace, promise me something." "Anything." "Never believe that kindness makes you ordinary." I smiled, thinking he was simply being sentimental again. I had no idea that only a few miles away, a man whose life had been shaped by power and caution was quietly closing a folder without reading another page because he had already learned everything important about me simply by watching how I treated people when I believed nobody was looking. The following Saturday began like any other, with the comforting smell of fresh bread rising through the bakery before sunrise and soft music playing from the old radio behind the counter. Customers came and went in steady waves, carrying warm pastries into the cool spring morning while sunlight poured through the front windows. I had just finished arranging a tray of blueberry muffins when the small bell above the entrance chimed again. Without looking up, I smiled and greeted the next customer. "Good morning. Welcome in." A cheerful little voice answered before anyone else could speak. "I found you." I looked toward the doorway, and for a brief second I wondered whether I was imagining things. The little girl from the rainy afternoon stood there with the same bright blue eyes and joyful smile, this time wearing a light yellow jacket and holding my old blue umbrella carefully in both hands. Before I could say a word, she ran across the bakery and wrapped her arms around me. Several customers paused to watch, smiling at the unexpected reunion. I laughed softly and hugged her back. "Well, hello there." She looked up proudly. "I told Daddy you would still be here." Only then did I notice the tall man walking through the entrance behind her. He carried himself with quiet confidence that seemed to make the room naturally fall silent. His tailored black coat rested neatly over a crisp white shirt, and the intricate black tattoos climbed above his collar, extending across his neck before disappearing beneath his sleeves, continuing over both hands exactly as though they had become part of who he was. Despite his commanding presence, his expression held nothing except calm gratitude. He stopped several feet away, giving me space instead of immediately approaching. "Miss Sullivan," he said respectfully, "I hope we are not interrupting your morning." I shook my head, still surprised. "Not at all." Sophie held out the umbrella with both hands. "I brought this back because it belongs to you." I accepted it gently, running my fingers across the familiar patch of clear tape near one corner. Somehow it looked even more valuable than before. "Thank you," I whispered. Sophie smiled proudly. Daddy dried it very carefully. Adrian glanced toward his daughter with quiet affection before returning his attention to me. She insisted on returning it herself. There was a brief silence before he continued. "My name is Adrian Moretti." I nodded politely. "Grace Sullivan." Although I had never met him before, there was something about the way people outside slowed as they looked through the bakery windows that suggested he was someone widely recognized. Yet inside the bakery, he behaved simply like a father keeping a promise to his daughter. "Miss Sullivan," he said, "I have wanted to thank you since the day you stayed with Sophie." I smiled gently. Anyone would have done the same. Adrian looked at me for a long moment before quietly shaking his head. "No." Many people walked past her. "You stayed." His words carried no judgment, only simple truth. I felt suddenly uncomfortable with the attention and quickly changed the subject. "Would either of you like something to eat?" Sophie's eyes brightened immediately before she glanced toward her father for permission. Adrian smiled. "One cinnamon roll, if that is all right." I laughed. "That is always all right." A few minutes later, the three of us sat at a small corner table near the bakery window. Sophie happily enjoyed her cinnamon roll while telling me about school, her favorite books, and how she wanted to learn baking someday. Adrian listened more than he spoke, occasionally smiling as his daughter filled every quiet moment with cheerful conversation. Watching them together surprised me. Whatever people outside the bakery might have believed about him, the man sitting across from me looked first and foremost like a devoted father. When Sophie wandered toward the display case to choose cookies for later, Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his coat and placed a sealed envelope gently on the table between us. "This cannot repay what you did," he said calmly. "Nothing could, but I would appreciate the opportunity to help in some small way." I looked down at the envelope without touching it. I already knew what was inside. Slowly, I slid it back toward him with both hands. "Mr. Moretti," I said with a warm smile, "if kindness comes with a price tag afterward, it stops feeling like kindness." Adrian remained completely still. His green eyes met mine, and for the first time since entering the bakery, genuine surprise crossed his face. Around us, the ordinary sounds of morning continued as customers chatted quietly and coffee cups gently clinked against saucers. Yet somehow the entire world seemed to pause inside that simple moment. Finally, Adrian picked up the envelope without another word. Then, with quiet sincerity unlike anything money could purchase, he nodded once and said, "Thank you for reminding me that some things are still beyond value." After Adrian and Sophie left the bakery that morning, I expected life to settle back into its familiar rhythm, but somehow the room felt different. My coworkers teased me about the elegant customer with the expensive coat and the little girl, who clearly adored me, yet I simply laughed and returned to arranging fresh pastries behind the display case. The old blue umbrella rested beside the employee lockers where I could see it every time I walked into the back room. It had become more than an umbrella now. It was a quiet reminder that even the shortest moments could leave the longest memories. That evening, I carried a fresh loaf of bread home for my father. He noticed my thoughtful expression before I even sat down at the kitchen table. Something happened today, he said with a knowing smile. I told him everything. I described Sophie's excitement, Adrian's respectful manner, and the envelope I had politely returned without opening. My father listened carefully before taking a slow sip of tea. Was he offended? He asked. I shook my head. No. Surprised, maybe, but not offended. My father smiled. Good people often surprise each other because they expect the world to work differently. I looked down at my hands. I hope he understands that I never helped Sophie expecting anything in return. From what you described, my father replied. I think he already does. Across the city, Adrian sat alone inside his private office overlooking the harbor. Evening sunlight reflected across the windows while the unopened envelope rested on the polished wooden desk exactly where he had placed it after leaving the bakery. His tattooed hands folded quietly as he remembered Grace's gentle smile when she had slid the envelope back toward him. During years of business negotiations, almost everyone he met wanted something. More money, more influence, more opportunity. Grace had been the first person in a very long time to refuse something valuable without hesitation simply because accepting it would have changed the meaning of her own kindness. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His longtime advisor entered carrying several documents. Sir, the donation agreements for the children's hospital are ready for your signature. Adrian signed each page without speaking before suddenly asking, Do you know the bakery where Miss Sullivan works? The advisor nodded. Yes, sir. Adrian remained quiet for another moment. Order breakfast for every employee there every Friday morning for the next 6 months. The advisor smiled. Should the gift mention your name? Adrian immediately shook his head. No. Then how should the order be labeled? Adrian looked toward the harbor. A grateful customer. The following Friday morning, our bakery owner stared in complete confusion as a delivery truck unloaded fresh coffee, fruit, and breakfast supplies for the entire staff. Attached to the receipt was a simple handwritten note. Thank you for making kindness part of your daily recipe. There was no signature. My coworkers guessed it might have been a loyal customer celebrating a special occasion. I simply smiled quietly because something about the careful wording felt familiar. Days passed, and little acts of anonymous generosity continued appearing in unexpected ways. The neighborhood food pantry where I volunteered suddenly received new shelves and a commercial refrigerator donated by an unnamed supporter. The elementary school across from the bakery announced funding for free breakfasts throughout the semester. None of the announcements included a name. They simply described an anonymous benefactor who wished to remain private. One afternoon, while stocking canned goods at the pantry, I mentioned the recent donations to the elderly volunteer working beside me. She smiled knowingly. Some people discover that gratitude grows best when nobody applauds it. Those words stayed with me during my walk home beneath clear blue skies. I still did not know much about Adrian Moretti beyond what I had seen with my own eyes. A devoted father, a respectful man, someone whose presence naturally commanded attention without demanding it. Whatever else people believed about him belonged to rumors, and I had learned long ago not to build opinions from stories told by strangers. As I reached my apartment building, I noticed a familiar black luxury vehicle driving slowly through the neighborhood before continuing toward the main road without stopping. I thought little of it until I reached my front door and found a small potted yellow daisy resting neatly beside the welcome mat. There was no card, no note, only a healthy little flower swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. I carried it inside and placed it beside the window where my father smiled the moment he saw it. Looks like someone remembered your favorite color, he said. I looked at the bright yellow petals glowing beneath the sunlight and smiled softly, realizing that sometimes the most meaningful thank you is the one that never asks to be recognized. Spring gradually settled over Boston, replacing cold rain with longer afternoons and trees covered in fresh green leaves. My routine remained comfortingly ordinary. Every morning began before sunrise at the bakery. Every afternoon ended with a walk through familiar streets, and every evening concluded with dinner beside my father while we shared stories about our day. I believed life had finally become peaceful again. Then small, unusual moments quietly began appearing around me. One Tuesday evening, the city bus I usually rode home broke down halfway through its route. The driver apologized as everyone stepped onto the sidewalk to wait for another bus. Several passengers sighed with frustration, but before anyone could become too impatient, Another city bus unexpectedly arrived only a few minutes later, even though that route normally did not pass through our neighborhood. The replacement bus carried us safely home with almost no delay. I thought nothing of it until the driver smiled at me before I stepped off. Looks like somebody upstairs wanted to make sure everyone got home tonight. I smiled politely, assuming he meant the transit supervisor. The following afternoon, I finished my volunteer shift at the food pantry later than usual. The streets had already begun to empty as evening approached. While crossing a busy intersection, an elderly man carrying 2 heavy grocery bags stumbled slightly near the curb. I hurried over, helping him regain his balance before carrying one of his bags the remaining 2 blocks to his apartment. He thanked me repeatedly, insisting that kindness like mine had become rare. As I walked away, I noticed a familiar black luxury sedan parked quietly across the street. It remained there only a few moments before smoothly pulling back into traffic. I could not explain why, but the sight felt strangely familiar instead of alarming. Later that week, my bakery manager apologized because someone had accidentally reserved every available parking space behind the building for maintenance vehicles. Employees without cars joked that the mistake did not affect them, and we all laughed together. As I stepped outside after my shift, I discovered a taxi already waiting beside the curb. The driver rolled down his window. "Miss Sullivan?" I blinked with surprise. "Yes. Your ride has already been paid for. There must be some mistake." The driver checked his note before smiling. "The instructions only say to make sure you arrive home comfortably." I politely declined, choosing to walk instead. The driver respected my decision without another question and quietly drove away. When I arrived home, my father listened thoughtfully as I described the strange coincidence. "Do you think it is the same person?" he asked. I looked out the kitchen window toward the quiet street below. "I honestly do not know." My father stirred his tea before smiling gently. "Whoever it is seems more interested in helping than being noticed." Across the city, Adrian stood inside a private conference room overlooking the skyline. His tattooed hands rested calmly on the back of a chair as one of his trusted associates finished a report. "Miss Sullivan continues her normal routine. She has not accepted any special treatment. She declined the taxi." Adrian nodded slowly, almost as though he had expected that answer. "Has anyone approached her again?" "No, sir. Everything remains quiet." Adrian looked toward the window where the setting sun reflected across rows of glass buildings. "Good." His associate hesitated before asking, "How long would you like us to continue watching over her?" Adrian answered without taking his eyes off the horizon. "Until I am certain that no one mistakes kindness for vulnerability." The words lingered in the silent room. Adrian understood something Grace herself did not. People who lived with open hearts often attracted both gratitude and selfishness. He had seen it too many times throughout his life. Quiet protection, when given respectfully and without interfering, seemed to him like the least he could offer in return. That Saturday afternoon, while walking home from the grocery store with 2 reusable bags full of fresh vegetables and bread, I paused outside a neighborhood park. Children laughed as they chased one another beneath bright blue skies, while parents watched from nearby benches. I smiled at the peaceful scene until a familiar little voice called my name from across the playground. "Grace." Sophie ran toward me with joyful excitement, her father following at a relaxed pace several yards behind. Adrian wore a simple charcoal sweater instead of his usual overcoat, though the intricate tattoos climbing across his neck and disappearing beneath his sleeves remained unmistakable. As Sophie hugged me, I realized something unexpected. Every coincidence during the past several weeks suddenly made a little more sense, and for the first time, I wondered whether gratitude had quietly become something much deeper than a single thank you. Seeing Sophie again felt as natural as watching the sun appear after days of rain. She wrapped her small arms around me with the same joyful energy she had shown inside the bakery, making several parents nearby smile as they watched. I laughed and hugged her gently before looking toward Adrian. He stood a respectful distance away, wearing a charcoal sweater, dark jeans, and comfortable shoes instead of the tailored suits I had grown used to seeing. The intricate tattoos climbed across his neck, covered both hands, and disappeared beneath his sleeves, remaining an unmistakable part of him, yet somehow they seemed less intimidating beneath the warm afternoon sunlight. "It is good to see you again," he said with a quiet smile. "You too," I replied. Sophie immediately grabbed my hand. Come feed the ducks with us. I looked toward Adrian. Are you sure I would not be interrupting family time? Before he could answer, Sophie giggled. You are making it better. Adrian laughed softly, the sound surprising even him. I believe that answers your question. We walked together along the small pond where dozens of ducks drifted peacefully across the water. Sophie carefully tossed small pieces of birdseed, while happily explaining the names she had invented for each duck. One was Captain, another was Pancake. A particularly noisy goose had somehow become Professor. Listening to her imagination made me laugh until my sides hurt. Adrian watched quietly beside me. She has always been creative, he said. She definitely gets that from someone. His expression softened. Her mother. There was no sadness in the way he said it anymore. Only love carried gently through memory. She passed away 4 years ago after a long illness. I turned toward him with sincere sympathy. I am so sorry. He nodded once. Thank you. We stood in comfortable silence while Sophie chased another group of ducks farther along the path. After a few moments, Adrian spoke again. She does not laugh like this very often. I followed Sophie's bright smile across the pond. She seems happy today. She is. He looked at me. Because she knew she might see you. I did not know how to answer. Instead, I watched sunlight shimmer across the water while a gentle breeze carried the scent of blooming flowers through the park. Eventually, we found an empty bench beneath a large maple tree. Sophie climbed onto the seat between us, happily eating the cookies I had purchased from a nearby food cart. After finishing the last bite, she rested her head against her father's shoulder. Daddy tells funny jokes now. Adrian looked slightly embarrassed. I smiled. Is that so? Sophie nodded enthusiastically. He never used to. Adrian chuckled. Apparently, I have a demanding audience. I looked at him curiously. What changed? He thought quietly before answering. Perspective. He watched children playing on the nearby swings. For a long time, I believed providing safety and stability was enough. Then someone reminded me that children also need ordinary moments. His eyes met mine. Moments like this. I felt warmth spread through my chest. Sometimes the ordinary moments become the ones they remember forever. Adrian nodded slowly. I believe you are right. A few minutes later, Sophie wandered toward a nearby ice cream cart with one of the park attendants supervising the children waiting in line. Adrian and I remained on the bench, listening to distant laughter and birds singing overhead. Grace, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. I looked at him with surprise. For what? He folded his tattooed hands together before speaking. Some of the unexpected help you have received recently came from me. The anonymous breakfasts, the flowers, the transportation arrangements. I never intended to interfere with your life. I only wanted to express gratitude without making you uncomfortable. I smiled gently because I had already begun to suspect the truth. I appreciate the kindness. He looked relieved, but remained serious. If any of it crossed a boundary, I am truly sorry. I shook my head. You respected my choices every time. That matters. He let out a slow breath. I also asked trusted people to quietly make sure you arrived home safely after work. I raised an eyebrow. You have been protecting me? Only from a distance, he answered honestly. Without disturbing your routine. You never asked for it, and I understand completely if you would rather it stop. I considered his words carefully. There was no arrogance in his voice. No expectation that I should be grateful. Only genuine concern offered with humility. I smiled softly. Then let me ask one favor instead. Anything. Next time you want to help me, come have coffee at the bakery. He looked genuinely surprised before smiling in a way that reached his eyes. That sounds much simpler. Sometimes simple is exactly what people need. As Sophie ran back toward us holding 3 vanilla ice cream cones with the biggest smile imaginable, I realized I was no longer looking at a powerful stranger whose reputation filled whispered conversations across the city. I was looking at a devoted father learning that the strongest foundation he could ever build was not made from influence or success, but from trust, honesty, and the quiet friendships that begin with one ordinary act of kindness. Summer arrived quietly, bringing longer evenings, warm sunlight, and the comforting feeling that life had finally settled into a gentle rhythm. Every Friday afternoon, after finishing my shift at the bakery, I met Adrian and Sophie at the small neighborhood cafe only a few blocks from the park. It had become an unspoken tradition. Sophie always ordered hot chocolate no matter how warm the weather became. insisting that it simply tasted happier than anything else on the menu. Adrian usually chose black coffee, while I never changed from chamomile tea. The cafe owner eventually stopped asking because he already knew our orders by heart. Watching them together became one of my favorite parts of the week. Adrian still carried the quiet confidence that naturally drew attention wherever he went. His tattooed neck, hands, and the intricate artwork disappearing beneath his sleeves remained impossible to overlook, yet I noticed something else now. He smiled more often. Not dramatic smiles meant for photographs or public appearances, but genuine ones that appeared whenever Sophie laughed or proudly shared another story from school. One Friday afternoon, she rushed into the cafe, carrying a paper bag almost as large as she was. "Nobody gets to open this until I say so," she announced with complete seriousness. Adrian raised an amused eyebrow. "That sounds important." "It is." She carefully placed the bag on the empty chair beside her before looking at both of us. "I worked on it for 3 weeks." I smiled. "Now I am even more curious." Sophie spent the next hour trying very hard not to reveal her surprise while we talked about ordinary things. Adrian mentioned that he had started taking weekends off whenever possible. I laughed because I could hardly imagine someone with his responsibilities allowing himself free time. He smiled. "My daughter informed me that work would still exist on Monday." Sophie nodded proudly. I made a schedule. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her backpack. Saturday morning was breakfast together. Saturday afternoon was the park. Sunday evening was movie night with homemade popcorn. Adrian looked at me with a helpless smile. "Apparently my calendar is no longer under my control." "I think you have an excellent manager," I replied. Sophie grinned as though she had just won an important negotiation. Before leaving the cafe, she finally stood up with the mysterious paper bag. "Now." She carefully reached inside and pulled out a soft green knitted scarf. The stitches were not perfectly even. One end was slightly longer than the other, and a few loops were looser than the rest, but it was unmistakably handmade with patience and love. She walked toward me, gently wrapped it around my neck, then stepped back to admire her work. "I made it for you." My eyes immediately filled with tears. "Sophie," she smiled shyly. "You stood in the rain for me, and then you gave me your umbrella. Daddy says people remember kindness. I wanted you to remember mine too." For several seconds I could not speak. I simply touched the scarf with trembling fingers, overwhelmed by the thought that a little girl had spent weeks creating something just for me. "This is the most beautiful gift I have ever received," I whispered. Sophie beamed with happiness before hugging me tightly. Adrian watched quietly from his chair. His expression carried the same calm strength I had come to know, yet his eyes reflected unmistakable emotion. After Sophie wandered toward the counter to thank the cafe owner for saving her favorite table every week, Adrian spoke softly. "She insisted on choosing green because she remembered the color you loved." I smiled through tears. "I will wear it every winter." He nodded. "She hoped you would." We sat together in comfortable silence until Adrian quietly added, "You changed more than one life that rainy afternoon." I looked at him curiously. He glanced towards Sophie laughing with the cafe owner before continuing. "She became less afraid of strangers because she learned kindness exists. I became less afraid of trusting people because I saw kindness without conditions. And somewhere along the way, I remembered that success means very little if there is nobody beside you when the workday ends." I looked down at the handmade scarf resting gently across my shoulders. "I did not change your lives," I answered softly. "I simply held an umbrella." Adrian smiled, slowly shaking his head. "No, Grace." His voice remained calm, but completely certain. "You reminded us that the strongest people are not the ones who stand above everyone else. They are the ones willing to stand beside someone who needs them." As we left the cafe together beneath a sky painted gold by the setting sun, I realized the little green scarf was warmer than any expensive gift could ever be, because every imperfect stitch carried a lesson no amount of money could purchase. Kindness, once given freely, has a remarkable way of finding its path home. 1 year later, the first autumn rain returned to Boston almost exactly the way I remembered it. The sidewalks shimmered beneath soft gray skies. The air carried the familiar scent of wet leaves and fresh coffee, and people hurried beneath umbrellas just as they always had. I stood outside the same bus stop where everything had quietly begun, wearing the handmade green scarf Sophie had knitted for me. It had become my favorite piece of clothing, not because it was perfect, but because every uneven stitch reminded me that love is measured by effort, never by perfection. I had stopped there on my way home from the bakery simply to enjoy the sound of the rain for a few peaceful minutes. Some memories deserve to be visited instead of forgotten. A familiar black vehicle pulled gently to the curb. Adrian stepped out first, wearing a dark overcoat over a crisp white shirt. The intricate tattoos stretched across his neck, both hands, and disappeared beneath his sleeves exactly as they always had. But his expression had changed completely since the first time we met. The quiet weight he once carried had been replaced by a calm warmth that appeared most clearly whenever Sophie was nearby. She jumped from the passenger seat, holding something carefully behind her back before running toward me with her usual excitement. "Close your eyes," she said. I laughed. Again. Yes. I obeyed, hearing only the soft rain and her tiny footsteps moving closer. A second later, something light rested gently in my hands. "Now look." I opened my eyes and found a beautifully framed drawing. It showed a rainy bus stop, a little girl standing beneath a blue umbrella beside a smiling woman, while a tall man approached from the distance. Above the picture, written carefully in Sophie's neat handwriting, were the words, "The day kindness found our family." My throat tightened so completely that I could barely speak. "Sophie," I whispered, "this is beautiful." She smiled proudly. "My art teacher said we had to draw the day that changed our lives." I looked from the drawing to Adrian. He quietly nodded. She knew exactly which day to paint. I held the frame close to my chest, feeling tears warm my eyes despite the cool rain. "I will treasure this forever." Sophie slipped her small hand into mine exactly as she had done the first time we met. "Daddy says memories should have homes." Adrian smiled gently. I believe she is right. We stood together beneath one large umbrella while the rain continued falling around us. Cars passed. Buses arrived and departed. The city moved forward without realizing that an ordinary sidewalk had become one of the most important places in 3 different lives. After a long moment, Adrian reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully unfolded something protected inside a clear plastic sleeve. I immediately recognized it. The small receipt from the bakery that had accidentally shown my name on the rainy afternoon when he first searched for me. Time had faded the paper slightly, but he had preserved it with remarkable care. "You kept it," I said quietly. He nodded. "It reminds me that extraordinary people rarely introduce themselves that way." I laughed softly through my tears. "I still think I only shared an umbrella." Adrian looked directly at me, his calm green eyes carrying complete sincerity. "No, Grace. You shared peace with a frightened child. You reminded a father that gratitude deserves humility. You taught both of us that compassion is stronger than influence." Before I could answer, my father slowly approached from the nearby sidewalk, carrying his favorite walking cane. He had insisted on meeting me after work despite my repeated offers to pick him up instead. Sophie immediately ran over to greet him with a cheerful hug. My father smiled warmly at Adrian before turning toward me. "Looks like your rainy day turned into a very sunny life." We all laughed together, standing there, surrounded by the people who had unexpectedly become part of one another's lives. I finally understood what my father had tried to teach me for years. Kindness is never an investment made because we expect something in return. It is a gift offered freely because it reflects the kind of person we choose to become. Sometimes that gift disappears into the world without another thought. Sometimes it quietly returns carrying friendship, healing, and hope. As we began walking together through the gentle autumn rain, sharing one umbrella instead of 3, I realized that the strongest shelters are never built from brick, steel, or wealth. They are built from ordinary hearts willing to stand beside one another when the world feels cold, and that kind of warmth can last a lifetime.